7 National News with Mal Waldon.
Treasurer Paul Keating delivers Labor's first budget in 8 years, but it's not the horror document some expected. The 1983 budget, of course, dominates 7 National News tonight. We're crossing now to Ken Begg and Lee Hatcher in Sydney to begin our coverage.
Good evening, I'm Ken Begg.
And I'm Lee Hatcher.
Welcome to Budget 83. And it's Clayton's budget. That's the budget you have when you're not having a budget. Tonight was that sort of an anticlimax. Paul Keating has gambled heavily on Australia, continuing to reap the benefits of the world economic recovery. The government's punt hinges on a growth rate for the nation of 5% over this financial year, something Australia hasn't achieved in 10 years. Will it happen? Certainly Mr Hawke and Mr Keating believe it will. And that's why all those dire predictions of the past couple of weeks haven't come to pass. We'll all be paying a bit more to get Australia back into the black. Lee, who's going to pay and how much?
Well, as you said, Ken, we'll all pay, but not by way of that much vaunted income tax surcharge. But if you drink, smoke, drive a car, and that just about covers everybody, you'll be hit. Petrol will be up 2 cents a litre as from tonight. Cigarettes up 3 cents a packet, and cigars and pipe tobacco up too from tonight. A bottle of beer will cost you 3 cents more, also from tonight. And because of a change in excise policy, tobacco products and beer will rise in price every 6 months, indexed to the cost of living. Also affected in the same way will be spirits by 20 to 30 cents a bottle. The top shelf has also been hit, not with the rumoured wine tax, but with a tax on the alcohol in fortified wines, ports, muskets and the like, up by only 40 cents a bottle. Sales taxes have not been changed, but not significantly. Videotapes, some cosmetics, including anti-dandruff products, are up by as much as 32%. But that won't worry you, Ken.
Well, thank you very much, Lee. Unemployments are also up, Lee. We'll be looking at social welfare picture in detail later, along with how families and businesses have fared. In the meantime, some more budget headlines. Funding for education is up by 11%, including increases of 5 to 7% for T students and 20% for secondary students. Defence spending is up 10.4%, essentially for major hardware purchases. Overseas aid will rise by 13%, with priority going to countries in our own region. With the Olympics just a year away, the allocation for sport has been increased by a whopping 48%. But culture hasn't missed out, with a 14.6% increase, including $289 million for the ABC. Aboriginal advancement programs have received a big boost, up by 28% to $207 million. Law and order and legal aid get $71.4 million, with a further $25 million a year to cover the cost of all our royal commissions, one of our few growth industries. And speaking of growth, the budget deficit, it's grown from an estimated deficit last year of $1.6 billion to Mr Keating's estimate for this year, a massive $8.4 billion. Talk has cheapened the impact of such a figure, although it's still within the perimeters that Labor laid down.
Mr Keating has labelled this a budget of fairness and equity, a reordering of priorities. That should be good news for families like the Manns, typical of Australia's 2.5 million families. Inevitably, it's Middle Australia that must provide the bulk of the finance for the government's budget strategies. Sue and Keith Mann and their children Adam and Patrick are typical of the young Australian family that's most vulnerable to the government's aspirations to balance its books. Their budget is tight. Keith, a warehouse manager in the publishing industry, has taken an effective salary cut in recent months because of the general economic downturn. Now he brings home around $225 a week. Of that, almost 50% goes towards mortgage repayments on their house. Food for the family takes around $55 a week. The other major expenses, petrol, fares, clothing and a little spending money, take care of the rest. The Manns rely on the family allowance to help meet unexpected payments, such as house maintenance, medical expenses and car breakdowns. They say there's no room in their weekly budget for much manoeuvring, but their expectations are that this year, at least, they'll have to help the government out of the economic dilemma.
And any government in any budget has got a fairly hard job to do unless it's in boom period. I think we have to be affected somewhere along the line. All we can hope for is that it's the minimal as possible.
Yeah, I don't think this budget will affect us greatly. in a good or a bad way. I don't think there's a lot they can do in this one that's going to hurt us too much. I think next year it'll be more positive. I think more positive things will be happening. They'll be in a better situation to be able to give people a bit more next year, I think. But this year things haven't gone as well as they thought.
You believe with the economists that the recovery is on the way?
Yes.
Is that
It's got to be, yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, I think things will get better. I don't think they can go much further down than they've gone.
And what did Sue and Keith think of Labor's first budget in 8 years? Philip Scholl found out tonight.
I don't know that I expected to have an extra $6.50 a week, but I did think it'd be a fairly good budget. I really didn't think it was going to hurt us too much.
This is a bit better than I expected.
Would you have liked to have got more than that? Do you think that's realistic, or would you think that the government could have given you more?
I think it's probably realistic in the economic times that we've got, or at least that are portrayed to us as general people.
If there had been not such a large increase, would you then have felt as though you would have been cheated?
I wouldn't, no. I don't think they could have done much more.
No,
We couldn't go into it expecting them to just be giving us money all over the place. As Keith said, the economic climate's not such that they can go increasing things all over the place. You can't. We couldn't have expected a lot of money out of it. No way. I'm really happy. I think that's fine.
That sense of anticlimax, that Clayton's feeling, is probably being echoed tonight in most families. The spouse rebate hasn't been abolished. In fact, it hasn't changed. There's been no change in family allowances. And of course, as we said, no change at all in income tax rates. It's Medicare that's going to make the difference for families when it's introduced next February. For the average family of 4 earning around $360 a week, the cost of health care will fall from $12 a week to $3.60. For most families, it's a case of win a few, lose a couple. Tomorrow, you'll be just that little bit ahead.
Eric Ristrom of the Taxpayers Association, would you agree with that?
No, not entirely. I have to say that when I went into the lockup today, I expected a tax surcharge from, fairly high incomes, maybe 27,000 beyond. And looking just at today's budget, I have to say that I was very much pleasantly surprised. But we cannot look just at tonight's budget. We have to, in fact, I believe it was brilliant politics to spread the May economic statement and tonight's budget, as two separate things. Had we got the May economic statement as part of tonight's budget, then I think the public's reaction would have been totally different. Paul Keating's papers say that there's $1,900 million of revenue in this present 83-84 year arising out of the budget. Out of the economic statement. Now, when we look at the family, if I just look at the budget as it is tonight, then I see perhaps $2, maybe $2.20 a week effect on the typical family. But taking into account the May economic statement, which really applies from 1st of July for this budget, we see several things happening. Medicare starting from the 1st of January next year with a levy of from then 1 cent in every dollar of income. The medical fund rebate has gone. The housing loan rebate for many people has gone. And I believe all that adds up for some people to a loss of about $10 a week. So tonight's budget, looked at in isolation, I'm pleasantly surprised. Coupled with the May economic statement, had it all come tonight, I'd be shocked.
Mr Ristrom, the government hasn't been brave at all, has it not? I mean, it itself was predicting a horror budget. Mr Hawke was predicting that for the past few months. What happened?
Well, I don't know what happened, and I had hoped tonight to ask Paul Keating earlier just what did happen. The expenditure is up 16%. In fact, that is the biggest rise in expenditure that we've seen for several years, I think 6 or 7 years. Taxpayers, I think, will be pleased that there's no income tax surcharge.
More on the 83 budget after this break, when we'll look at how business and industry are affected. Now continuing our coverage of the 83 budget, now described by Treasurer Paul Keating as an economic strategy based on fairness and equity. And with this look at how business and industry have fared, once again Lee Hatcher and Ken Begg.
Recovery in the private sector is fundamental to the restoration of Australia's economic health. So said Paul Keating tonight. But he failed to back that up with any concrete measures aimed at helping private enterprise. But he hasn't rocked the boat either. So the onus is on business to recover, given the improving world picture. Many companies might have hoped for more. Jones and Rickard is typical of the companies that must bear the brunt of Australia's immediate economic recovery. A private company going back almost 60 years. It's been finding the going tough, especially in the past 2 years. Today, it employs 55 people, down by 10 on the number it employed just 18 months ago. A metalworking shop, Jones and Rickard makes electric motors, frequency changes, lifting magnets, and provides a range of services in repairing both large and small electrical equipment. Its work is divided between the private sector and government contracts, and diversified activities have helped it to weather the economic downturn. But more direct measures have also been taken in coping with the tougher economic climate. Senior executives have not had a pay rise in more than 18 months, and other salaried staff have taken what amounts to pay cuts. Not so long ago, the factory was working 2 shifts a day. Now management says it's struggling to find enough work for 1 shift. The tough times have been reflected in the company's balance sheet. Sales are down 27% for the financial year just past, and profit is down 55% on the previous year, the lowest profit level in 5 years. The company has been battling to stay competitive by installing new plant and equipment. Taking advantage of the government's investment allowance, Jones and Rickard has recently spent more than $500,000 on an expansion program, but now the company is struggling to find work for its new equipment. Balanced against the reduced profits, the company had to pay out more than $200,000 last year in federal and state government taxes and charges. So what does the average company want from a federal government that looks to it to lead the way towards economic recovery? Jones and Rickard's commercial director, Martin Wellington, says there are some important ways the federal government could help. Retaining the investment allowance, increasing the ability of private companies to retain profits, hold or reduce company tax, but most importantly, help Australian industry through tariffs to compete with overseas manufacturers.
Of course, the tariff or non-tariff protection is the leveller between the cost of living or the type of standard of living which we wish to enjoy in this country and the cost of the goods that we have to pay for. And if you want to maintain your standard of living and all these other conditions, then obviously you can't expect to buy your goods from countries that don't have their 17.5% holiday loadings, probably pay a quarter of our wages, and can obviously produce goods very much cheaper than Australia can.
If business is people working, then things will get worse before they get better. Mr Keating expects unemployment to peak at 11.2% next January, up almost 1% on the present level. While that will mean about 750,000 jobless, the first half of next year should see some 130,000 new jobs. But that just holds the line. From that point on, Mr Keating hopes that as the national recovery picks up, the number of unemployed will fall further. Mr Keating admits to very great uncertainties, among them the international interest rates, and more importantly the prices and incomes accord, and the national wage case. For Australia's farmers, the government's adopting the user pays principles. That means small increases in wheat tax, meat and export inspection charges. On the other hand, there's more money to fight cattle diseases. Ken.
So much depends on how the trade unions react to the budget, as always. Bill Kelty, ACTU Secretary, what is the trade union attitude?
Well, overall, the budget is clearly responsible. It combines the right amount of economic responsibility with economic initiative.
Is it enough?
It's satisfactory.
Mr Keating, what sort of impact, Mr Kelty, sorry, what sort of impact will this have on the wage case?
Well, clearly the budget strategy of the government is premised on the implementation of the Prices and Incomes Accord. Clearly, 4.3% is the first step. The budget recognises that, and I would hope that it would give a clear indication to the Conciliation Arbitration Commission that that ought to be the outcome.
Mr Kelty, do you think that the increases as they were in beer, cigarettes and petrol, is that going to hurt the middle income earner? Is that going to hurt the wage earner more than necessary?
Well, I think you have to look at their proposal in perspective, and their marginal increase. They will add to the CPI by about 0.4%. So far as the Price of Incomes Accord is concerned, that will in fact be redeemed through full cost of living. In the longer term, the process of indexation will mean that indirect tax charges are neutral insofar as the inflationary impact is concerned and the accord is concerned.
Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelty, thank you. Having a lot of trouble with your name tonight.
Thanks.
Bert Evans, Metal Trades Industry. What does the budget do for industry, business?
Well, it's certainly not a hostile budget. I think Lee described it properly. It's a budget designed not to rock the boat, and that's what it's done.
Talks about a 5% growth rate. Do you see that?
I'd be pleasantly surprised if we had a growth rate of 5%. We haven't over time. I think they're talking about it growing at the rate of 5% towards the latter part of the year.
Mr. Evans, is this the end of the annual budget? Are we going to see more economic statements of importance rather than the one big document every year?
Well, we've certainly had two important budgets in a short space of time. I think we get too many budgets rather than, and I wouldn't like us to see having 3 or 4 in one given year. We need time to plan. It would be preferable if we didn't have these major announcements so quickly.
And joining us now here in Melbourne, our finance expert, Barry Dunstan. Barry, no real surprises in finance circles tonight?
No, the share market was right again, Mel. It's been rising as though this budget didn't exist, and there's nothing in tonight's document to worry investors. Only the old favourite targets like beer, spirits, cigarettes and petrol have felt Mr Keating's lash. The capital gains tax isn't really a frightener, and the surcharges on top incomes, a tax on gold mining profits, or even a tax on wine are nowhere to be found. As well, there isn't any move to reduce investment allowances, although there also isn't any sign of the promised tax relief for small businesses. In short, this is a budget framed by Mr Keating and Mr Hawke not to frighten investors, either here or overseas. It is a budget very much designed to give the economy a big boost, a point which Treasury makes umpteen times in its separate economic comments. In fact, Treasury seems to spend almost as much time hosing down economic hopes after next year as in boosting our spirits. Mr John Stone, the head of Treasury, has his doubts about whether big amounts of bonds can be sold without pushing up interest rates. He's doubtful about beating inflation. And perhaps most significantly, he has doubts about whether overseas economic recovery can last beyond this financial year. For this year at least, company profits will recover. And if it can live with Mr Stone's uncertainties, the share market might yet have a little rise left. But while investors tonight raise their glasses, using some of that stockpiled wine, they ought to hope that the budget stimulus doesn't stimulate wage increases. Because while this innocuous budget rolls on, Treasury has given fair warning it's prepared to tighten the screws if things even look like overheating.
Thank you, Barry. Next, a detailed look at how pensioners have fared, the Victorian Government's reaction to the budget, as well as interviews with Treasurer Paul Keating and Opposition Leader Andrew Peacock. Assistance for the unemployed and for pensioners. That's one of the strong points from tonight's budget. More on that now from Ken Begg.
For the single adult unemployed, a rise of $4.95 a week, giving them now $73.60 a week. There's a promise too, indexation in line with the heartening news for the 450,000 people involved. There's a further promise of another $2 next May. Young unemployed, those under 18, get another $5, giving them $45 a week. But for them, no promise of indexation. For those with a pensioner health benefit card, some good news. The income test for the cards will be tied to movements in the Consumer Price Index. For children of pensioners, and there are 800,000 of them, there's a $2 increase in their allowance, the first increase since 1975. The same increase will apply to low-income families under the Family Income Supplement.
Perhaps the most controversial aspect of the budget social welfare program is the reintroduction of an assets test on the income and assets of aged pensioners. Social Security Minister Don Grimes has yet to announce all the details, but Mr Keating tonight gave a few hints. Exempt will be a pensioner's home, car, personal effects, including furniture, a boat, caravan, jewellery and works of art, and other assets to the value of $1,500 for a single pensioner and $2,500 for pensioner couples.
And there's something else that will rankle. Income earned by pensioners from friendly society accounts will now become part of your income. Husbands who look after disabled wives will be entitled from December this year for a spouse carer's pension. This re-establishing of priorities, as Mr Keating puts it, will increase the government's spending on social welfare issues by 19.3%.
The Treasurer Paul Keating tonight said his first budget was designed to get Australia moving again. He said it would lay the foundation for genuine economic recovery and increase employment.
I see this budget laying the foundation for a long-term economic recovery for Australia. That's the government's principal commitment to the electorate, and its other commitment was to make sure that those in need were helped. In this budget we've done both. We've looked at those priorities and we've been able to make these spending decisions by clearing away so much of the former government's programs. We've cleared away about $1.8 billion to put in place expenditure programs of about $2.5. And in doing so, we've met all of the expectations, I believe, which were created in the course of the election campaign. It's a budget which asks the men and women of Australia to make a modest contribution to those major tasks.
Treasurer, why is cigarettes, beer and the like and not a surcharge at the higher end of the income scale? And aren't you going to be seen to be hitting the small man, leaving the big fish alone?
Well, I think there's a great fallacy about the revenue which is available on the top end of the scale. For 1 cent increase above the 60% marginal rate brings in $30 million. And what we've done here is not to increase in a discretionary sense the excise on beer or cigarettes or those traditional areas outside of petrol, but we have taken the step of indexing the excise base so that the real value of excises doesn't erode as it has in previous years, when then governments need to come along with very large increases in excise, which of course have then a major impact on the inflation rate. They have a major impact, detrimental impact on industries. So we're looking at adjusting them regularly twice a year, and the cost of this adjustment is very modest. It's about 3 cents on a packet of cigarettes. It's about 1 cent on a midi or 3 cents on a bottle of beer. Now, I contrast that with the increase in cigarettes of 15 cents a packet in the last budget and over 20 odd cents by some of the state governments. So we've not increased in that area discretionary. There are adjustments to the excise rates as a result of the inflation rate.
There's been rises for the unemployed. Why not rises for pensioners? After all, the government was committed to raising their incomes to 25% of average weekly earnings.
Yes, and pensions have been indexed by the Consumer Price Index through the period when wages have been static, particularly for a lot of people in the workforce for the greater part of 12 months. And so the proportion of pensions to average weekly earnings has been rising and has risen quite substantially towards that 25% target. And given the fact that the government had to make decisions about the objectives with which it funded areas of pressing need, particularly the single unemployment benefit rate, which had languished for so long, and the unemployment benefit rate for people under 18 years of age, that in terms of priority, that we regarded that as a priority given the fact that we've already maintained the real value of age pensions through the indexation system.
In contrast, Opposition Leader Andrew Peacock has described the budget as totally irresponsible. He said it will in fact promote inflation and indicates the government is taking the wrong approach to boost the Australian economy. Mr Peacock added a Liberal approach would have been completely different.
We would have in fact reduced government spending, as we've indicated before. We were looking for a deficit of around the $7 billion mark. We've explained that over a period of some months now, and I think this has been totally irresponsible to fix a figure of approximately 8.5 in advance, which is slightly below that in the budget, and then just fit the parts accordingly.
Mr Peacock, does the budget contain any positive measures?
Not in my view, other than the assistance, of course, to disabled, the unemployed, and those areas which naturally would be welcomed. But in other areas, you've heard my earlier remarks.
Mr Keating says that the budget will contain inflation. Do you agree with that?
I certainly don't, and the indications, as I've just mentioned to you, of the Treasury paper itself, budget paper number 2, would explode that myth. Succinctly put, the Treasury has certainly stabbed the Treasurer in the back. That budget paper points out, particularly at pages 57 and pages 70, just how the Australian economy could collapse through increased wages, which we know are already in place, and what is intended through the return to indexation. Australian industry is uncompetitive now, it'll be made less competitive this time next year. And Treasury's warnings ought to be noted in that paper.
Mr Peacock, your comment on increases in unemployment benefits, would the Liberal Party have increased them by more or not as much?
Well, I'm pleased. I mean, we would have to frame an overall budget. I'm pleased that there is an adjustment in unemployment benefits. But as for the undertaking that was made in the election campaign, that there would be 500,000 new jobs created, this is not evidenced from this budget. Jobs can only be created if industry is competitive, and industry will not be competitive through this budget.
Given the history of the Liberal governments in overrunning their deficits 5 years in a row, do you think it's likely that Labor will do the same?
Well, it's a high-spending, high-taxing government, and they were unquestionably fitting these pieces together on the 8.5, but I in fact think that it will run beyond that, and quite clearly Treasury does too.
Can you put an estimate on it?
Mr Peacock, will you reverse the decision to increase excises every 6 months?
Well, we'll be looking at the totality of the matter. We never introduced them when we were in government, so it's hardly likely that we would welcome them now.
Do you think they're a good idea, though?
Well, I just indicated to you we never did it, because when these views were put to us, we rejected them.
The prospects for the Australian economy under this budget over the next 12 months?
Well, I indicated to you that it's an irresponsible budget, that I believe that it will run out beyond the deficit that is projected in the figures here, that the Treasury itself, the principal advisors to the government, are deeply concerned, A, with interest rates, and B, with wage increases. So concluding that there is a high possibility of this falling about the feet. Some people may say it's a budget that's steady as she goes, but steady as she goes downwards.
Victoria's Treasurer Rob Jolly has welcomed tonight's budget, saying it's moving in the right direction, a direction that was laid down in Victoria's state budget last year. But Mr Jolly said the federal budget will only have a marginal effect on the state budget soon to be handed down, and hasn't ruled out the possibility of a small income tax levy for Victorians. Mike Barrett asked Mr Jolly his reaction to the first Hawke government budget.
Well, I'm pleased that the budget's going to stimulate the economy. I think that was the most important decision that had to be made by the federal government, and they predict that over the course of the year that there will be an increase in employment of about 1.5%. That means 130,000 more jobs throughout the nation.
Along the lines of the budget that you handed down?
The main thrust of the new expenditure items in the federal budget are similar to the 1982 budget in Victoria, that is, emphasis on capital expenditure, housing and employment.
There were some of the things that you could have been looking for. For example, there was no compensation for loss of revenue with the oil pipeline. Are you still hopeful that that may be forthcoming?
I'm certainly still hopeful about that issue, because when we had discussions with the Prime Minister, he indicated that the federal budget had already been put in place and that any decision on the pipeline licence fee would have to be taken outside the budget framework.
Well, with no overall adjustment to income tax in the federal budget, will the state government now consider imposing a small tax levy in its own budget to help Victoria overcome its financial difficulties?
As I've stated publicly elsewhere in respect to our revenue-raising measures, we're going to consider in detail the recommendations of the revenue-raising inquiry. We'll consider any submissions that have been made to us on taxation matters, and our decisions will be revealed in the 1983 budget.
So they still haven't been ruled out at this stage?
No taxation decision has been ruled out at this stage. What I've indicated is that we're going to keep any taxation measure to an absolute minimum.
There wasn't much in it as such for Victoria tonight. Does that put you in an awkward situation?
No, as a national budget, we expected the federal government to tackle the national issues by increasing employment throughout Australia. Of course, Victoria's going to benefit.
That's all in the budget for now. We'll have a final summary later in this bulletin. But next, President Marcos of the Philippines warns against reprisals following the assassination of Benigno Aquino, and tonight, a new military crisis in Chad. Those details after this break. Tonight in the African state of Chad, there are reports that Libyan forces are advancing towards the capital of N'Djamena, 80 kilometres south of Faya-Largeau. Chad's information minister says large-scale troop movements have been reported, along with several battalions of tanks. The minister says that there are currently 5,000 Libyan forces in the war-torn area in support of former President Woudaire. In the Philippines, 12 political groups have called for a united and non-violent campaign to restore democracy in their country. The call comes after the assassination of the opposition leader Benigno Aquino at Manila Airport last Sunday. Philippines President Marcos has warned opposition groups against taking action now, saying his government is still well in control. The warning came during a televised press conference in which the president said he was as shocked as anyone by the assassination.
I am deeply and profoundly shocked by what has occurred. It It has affected me not only emotionally, but physically.
But the president was quick to deny rumors that he or his wife Imelda, a political power on her own here, had anything to do with the assassination. Marcos did, however, have a few thoughts on who might have been behind the killing. The Philippine president walked his audience through previous charges made against Aquino, linking him with the communist New People's Army and their reported later bitter parting of the ways. Marcos expanded the theory, adding that the NPA could have assassinated Aquino to kill two birds with one stone. The opposition leader literally, the Marcos government figuratively. Marcos called on all Filipinos to remain calm. He also warned opposition leaders not to take advantage of the situation, adding his government was still firmly in control and would remain so.
And still overseas, and the Israeli government says it will start pulling back its troops from Lebanon's Shuf Mountains on Sunday. And even though this comes as a sign of peace in the troubled area, more fierce fighting has broken out. This latest outbreak between Muslim and Christian militia forces has left many dead and injured.
Lebanese Christian militia and Druze resumed their efforts at destroying each other. It began with an occasional crack of a sniper's rifle and built to salvos of rockets, artillery, and machine guns. It was one of the most brutal exchanges since last summer's Israeli invasion, but this time it was mostly Lebanese firing on Lebanese. American Marines who tracked some of the incoming fire aimed at Christian positions said it came from Syrian guns higher up in the Shuf Mountains. The casualty figures vary, but go as high as 12 killed and 67 wounded. Some of the artillery fell close to Beirut airport, but it remained open. A Druze leader says if government forces continue to fire on his villages, they will again force the closing of the airport. There are fears here the warfare will become even more intense after the Israelis withdraw their forces from the hills outside of Beirut to positions further south.
Back in Melbourne, and warders at Pentridge Jail have foiled the third escape attempt since the 4 prisoners got out of the maximum security Jaika section some 3 weeks ago. This time it's believed up to 6 prisoners were preparing to flee. And as Norm Beeman reports, among them were some of the state's most dangerous criminals.
They included convicted kidnapper Colin Vincent Stratton and former prison escapees and armed robbers Trevor Charles Bradley and Ross Burley. The men had all but cut through a faceplate of an air conditioning duct in a day room of the Jaika complex. They'd concealed their operation by hanging up washing at strategic points. The plot was discovered last night during a detailed inspection of the room after warders had earlier reported hearing unusual noises coming from that area. Police today were angry at the continuing access by prisoners to materials to aid their escape.
As long as it's decreed that they can have access to materials to pursue their hobbies, and those kind of hobbies entail the use of hardware, well, it's going to continue, I'm afraid.
Federal police in Sydney tonight arrested a 32-year-old man on a Perth-bound TAA flight following mid-air threats to the aircraft's cabin and crew. That should have been captain and crew. The flight left Mascot Airport shortly after 6:30, but turned back after 10 minutes when the plane's captain radioed that a man had made threats to himself and his crew. A federal police spokesman says the man was not armed, but had suggested to the crew that he had a weapon. The spokesman said a Perth man has been charged and will appear in St James Court in Sydney tomorrow. A person described as a well-respected Traralgon family man was today committed to stand trial for the murder of an escort agency girl last New Year's Eve. Roy Leslie Rhodes has pleaded not guilty to the alleged murder of Dale Lockwood at the Prince Mark Motor Inn at Doveton.
Police were called to the motor inn after an attendant discovered a naked female body lying on the floor of room 11 with a pillow over her head. The room had been booked out to a person later identified as Roy Rhodes, a rigger of Traralgon. Police told the coroner today there was evidence of a violent struggle. The body had signs of bruising and there was blood around the killing scene. The cause of death was given as asphyxiation. Evidence given today indicated Rhodes arranged to meet the escort agency girl at the motel. Police said Rhodes told them the fee was to be $500. However, the girl didn't give him the service he required. He admitted to slapping her on the face and holding a pillow over her head. Defence counsel pleaded that Rhodes had not meant to kill Miss Lockwood but merely stop her screaming. However, the coroner found there was a case to answer. Rhodes, who pleaded not guilty, was ordered to stand trial for murder in the Supreme Court.
Queensland State Railways Department was thrown into chaos today after a taped extortion threat was found by a railway employee. The extortionist told authorities that he'd plant an explosive device on a rail line somewhere in the state if his demands for a large sum of money were not met.
The tape, found late last night by a rail employee, was only partly disclosed to the media today for security reasons.
When you receive the documents, you will have 24 hours in which to find and deactivate the accessory.
Police say they have no intention of meeting the extortionist demands, and this morning began the massive task of searching all tracks and bridges throughout Queensland for any suspicious devices. The search will continue until the threat is passed to ensure the safety of all rail passengers. And in Victoria, the railway line between Melbourne and Adelaide collapsed near Bacchus Marsh this morning, derailing the Overland Express. No one was seriously injured when 6 carriages, including the buffet car, left the rails near the Parwin station. The 268 passengers were ferried to Melbourne by bus. It's the third derailment in Victoria since Thursday, the other 2 being at Kilmore East and near Benalla.
In Tasmania, conservationists are again embroiled in a battle over the southwest of the state. This time, vandals have destroyed the oldest Huon pine tree in the southern hemisphere. The tree, thought to be about 4,000 years old and which stood in the World Heritage Area, was burnt and then cut down by vandals.
This is film shot during the Franklin blockade, and this tree was one of the many natural monuments the Wilderness Society thought it had saved. The tree, just a 5-minute walk from the Hydroelectric Commission's Warner's Landing worksite, had already escaped the Piners Axe because it was too big for removal and too old for boat building. Now it's good for nothing. Wilderness Society members who visited the site at the weekend say the tree has been chainsawed, then drilled with a large machine and doused with petrol. At a press conference this afternoon, Society Director Dr Bob Brown said the area was out of bounds to citizens and National Parks rangers. He said it was a standing joke by HEC personnel that the tree had been struck by lightning or something. But when contacted this afternoon, an official HEC spokesman would only say our people found the tree burning and put it out.
It would appear that the stock exchange did not believe those forecasts of a horror budget. In fact, the market gained 3 points today. 411 stocks were traded, and of those 167 rose and only 80 fell. Among the indices, most interest was focused on industrial posts, and the index closed at 4.6 up. The metals group lifted 3.5, oil and gas gained 10.3, and the 50 litres rose 3.1, and the all ordinaries increased 3.7. In the top traders, Bundaberg rose 13 cents. BHP remained steady, as did Western Mining. Westpac dropped back 1 cent and CRA dropped back 4. Melbourne's running firemen arrived home today after their record-breaking 15,000-kilometre round Australia marathon. Alona Komisarov accompanied the weary firefighters on the last stretch of their run into Melbourne. And even though the firemen were happy to be home, they were disappointed that their gruelling charity run raised less than half of what they wanted.
The men aged between 24 and 51 set out from the GPO 6 weeks ago to run around Australia in 45 days, both to set a new marathon record and to raise $100,000 for the Red Cross. Averaging 3 hours sleep a day, braving loneliness, torrential rain, knee-deep mud, burning heat and freezing nights, the men ran 24 hours a day non-stop to complete the 15,000-kilometre marathon on time. This afternoon, sprains and blisters were not on their minds when the emotional team arrived back to their families and a hero's welcome in the City Mel.
To run up Swanston Street like that, with a crowd like that, it's unreal. Fair income. Unbelievable. People of Melbourne, Victoria, Australia's great, but home's fantastic.
What was the hardest part of being away for so long?
Oh, you just miss family so long, you know. First couple of weeks not too bad, but then it gets into the third and the fourth week and you're way up the top there and you're a long way from home. It was hard to hang on.
The team broke 3 world records, but were bitterly disappointed that they only raised less than half of their target. But they hope that they may have inspired people to help them achieve their goal.
And out of sport, and Carlton's Peter Bosustow seems certain to return to Perth next season. Peter has spent the last 24 hours thinking about his future after being suspended for 4 weeks by the VFL Tribunal. In an exclusive interview with Max Stevens, Bosustow said the ball was now with Carlton.
He was back at Princes Park this evening, but for just how long is the question.
family commitments in WA and the tribunal's decision last night are the reasons that his football career in Melbourne may come to an end. His former club, Perth, finished wooden spooners this season. According to Perth's coach, Ian Miller, the club's top priority is to get the buzz back. And I understand nothing will stop them this time. Incidentally, his contract with Carlton expires at the end of this year. Earlier today, Peter told me how keen he was to finally return to Perth.
Very keen, Max. You know, I really did make up my mind last year to play in Perth, and Carlton realised that, and I think a lot of the media in Melbourne realised that as well. When Carlton come across, as I say, with the technicality of the contract, I decided, well, I laid in my own bed in 1981. I really had to make it then and fulfil the 1983 part of the contract. So, you know, it was no secret that I wanted to stay, Max, and if Perth make it attractive enough for me to come back, you know, I'll be doing that. But
you must have a fair idea that you want to go back and play there next year.
Yes, I think so, Max. You know, that's really, it's up to Carlton now to sort of talk me back into, you know, coming back in 1984, and, you know, last night didn't help.
In other sports news, the VFL's media manager, Ian McDonald, has resigned and will take up a similar post with the Australian Cricket Board. McDonald will vacate his Jolimont office following the grand final after spending 6 years with the VFL. In Newport, Rhode Island, the now famous winged keel is becoming a popular commodity. It started with Australia 2, and now the British yacht Victory 83 has used winglets on her keel for the first time. However, the additions did little for the British yacht in the latest race, which it lost to Australia 2. We'll be returning to the budget after this break, when we'll have a final summary from Ken Begg and Lee Hatcher. And now a final look at the Hawke government's first budget, and for their last word, Ken and Lee.
So here again are the major points in Labor's budget. Beer, spirits, cigarettes and petrol are up as from tonight. There's to be an assets test for aged pensioners. Unemployment benefits are up across the board, and they'll be indexed for those over 18. There's no increase in income taxes. The family allowance is untouched, and most average families should, by our reckoning, emerge relatively unscathed once Medicare begins and the cost of health care goes down next year.
Put simply, Mr Keating has pinned his faith on America's long-awaited economic recovery. If it keeps on the boil, Australia, through this budget, will start the long haul to recovery. Incredibly, Mr Keating forecasts an economic growth rate of 5%, something not achieved in 10 years. But unemployment will continue to stay high. But again, depending on recovery, which may peak at around 750,000 next January. So that's Budget 83, steady as she goes.
That's the way we saw budget night. But before we go, a look at Melbourne's weather. And after an overnight low of 10 degrees, we're in for a mild Wednesday with increasing cloud and rain developing very late in the day. At present, it's very late in the day. It's 12 degrees. Today's top temperature should be 21 degrees. And with that in mind, it's not a bad way to end 7 National News. I'll be back with the major edition at 6:30 tomorrow night. And don't forget, we'll have full reaction to the budget in 11 a.m. In the meantime, take care. Good morning, Australia.